You just returned from the conference, the European Exopolitics Conference in Barcelona, so I know that you wanted to report on what went down at that conference.
Yes, it was a really interesting gathering. We had, they think around 1,000 people there, and there were speakers from all over the United States and the world who were represented. And I gave 2 keynote addresses, which are actually on the web that people can listen to. And one of the things that keeps coming up in the context of these sort of events is this whole question of, are some of these extraterrestrial civilizations, maybe just a few of them, hostile or do not have the best interest of the Earth and humanity in mind? And this is, of course, the foundation for much controversy within the whole UFO subculture. And I think it's something that came up very strongly at this conference, really outside the formal conference, but it came up in the course of the conference. And we'll talk about some of the things that happened there. And I think that one of the things that I've always wanted to emphasize to people is that in my briefings with very high-level people in the governments of the United States and others around the world, I have never seen anything to indicate that we're under any kind of hostile invasion or anything that can be construed as hostility from these visitors. What I think has happened is that there's been a lot of things that have occurred where there have been misunderstandings of different types of phenomena or different types of experiences. And I think that's something we want to talk about today. For example, many people have had experiences with man-made pseudo-aliens, we call them programmed life forms, that are man-made in their entirety, that look like aliens, and they're not. And we have known about this. I have known about it since the early 90s, but they've been in existence for many, many years before that. And these have been used in conjunction with things that look like, quote, flying saucers or alien reproduction vehicles is what they're called in the biz, in sort of the aerospace industry, electromagnetic-gravitic devices. And these have been used in a number of programs to create a psychological counterintelligence effort to create fear and have created the worldwide phenomenon known as the abduction phenomenon. And I think that many people don't understand the extent to which there's a huge confusion between the actual interstellar civilizations visiting here and the dominant, shall we call it, shadow alien activities. And those shadow alien activities actually are the dominant ones that are reported, and therefore it causes enormous amounts of confusion. I think in addition to that, and this is why in 1990, I believe it was 6, way back, a long time ago, I wrote a paper on extraterrestrials and the new cosmology, where I discuss the whole concept of what kinds of manifestations of intelligence you might see from an interstellar civilization. This certainly isn't going to be moving around like a rocket or something like that. But also the technologies interface with consciousness. But beyond that, there are many other things that people experience. Some would call these ultra-terrestrials as opposed to extraterrestrials, things from the spirit world, such as poltergeist or angelic beings, or on the other end of the spectrum, demonic beings that are rather frightening. And many of these things, basically anything that's gone bump in the night, if anyone who's ever looked at the X-Files program, will know that these things have all been thrown into a sort of a catch-all term of, quote, aliens. But the problem with that is that they're very, very different phenomena because, as Monsignor Balducci at the Vatican pointed out, angels don't need flying saucers, and for that matter, neither do demons. And I think that we have a question where many people think that just because it's something weird that they've experienced, because we're in the space age, it's extraterrestrial. Well, it isn't. And there are many different experiences people have that have now made its way into the mythology of the UFO folklore as being extraterrestrial when it is not. Now, I think that this is really compounded by the fact that back in 1953, the CIA determined that this whole issue would be a wonderful source for, quote, and I'm quoting from the document, psychological warfare programs. And that's exactly what they proceeded to do. And in other documents even described engaging Hollywood to make films that would present the whole subject in a certain way. And there are two directions that the intelligence community wanted the whole extraterrestrial issue to be presented. One would be sort of a fantasy-driven, silly way that would kind of ridicule it, kind of cartoonish, and the other would be very frightening, such as the movie Independence Day, where, of course, Will Smith famously said, "Let's kick alien butt," and, the whole thing of uniting the whole world around a threat from outer space. Now, we have learned, of course, from no less a figure than Wernher von Braun, who was the core of the space program in the United States, and also was Wernher von Braun, as many people know, invented the V-2 rocket for Hitler. His spokeswoman for the last several years of his life has confirmed what I've heard from many other people, including recently a colonel who had worked with Ronald Reagan when Ronald Reagan was president, regarding the SDI or Star Wars initiative, and that is that there was a deliberate attempt to demonize the UFO subject and the extraterrestrial presence so that people would accept the cost of interplanetary conflict, and that this was all part of a psychological conditioning program, and that they would manufacture this, quote, threat from outer space when, in fact, none exists. So I think that people have to proceed extremely cautiously into this area because you have a subject that's actually had hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of funding that has gone into all kinds of counterintelligence and psychological warfare programs that are designed very specifically to frighten people. And these programs are very, very sophisticated. Unfortunately, it's not just informational like through Hollywood. It's also operational. And I think that's what we need to talk about a little bit. And that is these operational programs that masquerade as quote-unquote alien, but are not extraterrestrial. And this is an area of great controversy, and it really is the third rail of the UFO subject. And I think for that I need to go back to a conversation I had with a man named Martin Cannon, who back in the 1980s, this was over 20 years ago, had put together a very exhaustive, I think about 2,000 footnotes, research library on a sort of paramilitary human involvement with what the public were calling abductions and mutilations and things of this sort. And he had found and confirmed that that was being launched by humans as a psychological warfare program using very, very sophisticated technologies. Well, he had his home broken into, his computer hacked into, all of his files taken, and he was blacklisted from every New Age and UFO conference because he dared speak the truth. And I think that this heroic man who I spoke to, he said, Dr. Greer, if you expose this, you're pulling back the curtain on really the big secret and the big lie and the big hoax that's out there, because they're desperately wanting people to believe in the good alien, bad alien, Manichean view of this, so that people will, down the road, and now it's not down the road that far, this is 20 years later, will accept the cost of an interplanetary conflict. And I said, yes, well, I was aware that this was the long-term agenda of the so-called Majestic Group, the group that had kept this secret since the 40s. And because we had documents to this effect, but also that we had witnesses who were brought to Washington to brief members of Congress that I organized in 1997, and one of whom had been on a committee, an interagency, all the three-letter agency committees, where he had been told very specifically that they had these extraordinary vehicles that are anti-gravity vehicles that are man-made by Lockheed, Skunk Works, and Northrop and other companies, and also these creatures, which have been dubbed program life forms. These things look like ETs, but they're man-made, completely man-made items, and that these were going to be used in eventually a program to hoax a false flag attack on the planet, because by doing so, the military-industrial controllers would be able to reconstitute and actually expand global control, sort of a military junta that would be over the entire planet instead of just over the United States and the United Kingdom and a few other places, and that it would expand the funding for weaponizing space and creating this sort of fear. And remember, and of course, they all have understood that humans, having sort of a midbrain that has a fight or flight response, respond very heavily to negative and respond very heavily to fear and anything that's a threat to their survival, because we're wired to survive. And that by using these sorts of images, but also engaging operationally in a paramilitary human-initiated abduction program where there are actually abduction squads, and I've interviewed men who have been on these squads that use extremely well-developed stagecraft, up to and including psychotronics and radionics, which are a type of electromagnetic systems that affect consciousness, various chemicals to induce an unconscious state, these alien reproduction vehicles, and then these strange-looking creatures that move around that look like a sort of a gray, some would call them a classic gray or a classic reptile creature. And, of course, many of these are not what they appear to be, if not most. And I think that this has also happened worldwide. I was just in Spain and met with the most renowned long-term researcher of this subject in Spain, who strangely was not speaking at the conference, but who was there at the conference, and a very nice older gentleman. And he said, but he was in Argentina years ago and met a man in the intelligence community. He gave me the man's name, but I'm not going to mention it here, who had set up the Psychotronics and the abduction squads in Argentina. And he asked me if I thought that was surprising, that it would be in other developing countries as well as in the United States and the UK. I said, no, not at all. I know it's a worldwide effort to create the specter of a threat from outer space, because how else can you create a database, albeit a false and hoax database, of an evil alien presence that the world needs to unite around and fight? Now, this is, of course, exactly what Douglas MacArthur, in his last address to Congress, sitting in Congress, said. He said World War III will be interplanetary, and that there was an intent determined way back in at least the 50s to take this subject, create a psychological nexus of fear, that's sort of the ultimate false flag operation. Forget 9/11. This would be on a cosmic scale, and to control, the 6 or 7 billion people on the planet through that fear. And the kinds of programs and technologies that have been developed over the last 60 years using virtually a limitless supply of money are really quite impressive, rather depressing, but rather impressive. And subsequent to this, I have actually interviewed people who have worked in the deep underground Dulce facility that has an underground connector to Los Alamos, as well as people who work out near in the Nellis Range, people what pop culture call Area 51, although it's not exactly what it's called. It's Area Mesa and S4 and S12 and S9, that they have actually worked in the programs underground where they have had been building these alien-looking creatures. Now, recently, there have been some witnesses who come out who were in these programs who worked or saw these creatures in these facilities, and they said, well, there are these strange aliens that they thought were extraterrestrial working with a classified project, and they didn't understand that those were man-made program life forms, PLS, that are both genetically engineered as well as have integrated circuits and computerized programs in their neural cortex. And these are not extraterrestrial, they are not interstellar, and it is a very well-developed program. Unfortunately, everyone talks about, even James Defense Weekly, Nick Cook and others, and in his book, I believe he called it the Race to Zero Point or Hunt for Zero Point, that there were all these studies going on in the 40s and 50s and even before that into anti-gravity and really advanced propulsion systems. What was forgotten is that an equal amount of effort has gone into the genetic programs and into the really sort of brave new world, scary stuff that are I would say these programs are the spiritual descendants of Mengele and other, Dr. Mengele and others who created were trying to create a sort of really bizarre medical and genetic experiments during the Nazi era in Germany. And I think that from interviewing all these people, not just one source, but multiple sources, that there are very advanced programs dealing with these genetics and dealing with these biological program life forms, which have been then used with the anti-gravity devices and the psychotronics and certain chemicals, a la the famous MK Ultra program that people can Google, that are mind-altering, to give people different experiences. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who's had contact with an extraterrestrial appearing life form has been the victim of a man-made pseudo-abduction or man-made pseudo-alien encounter. But I think the dominant cases that you hear about are those. And this is a very difficult thing to bring up because I had Dr. Brian O'Leary, the Apollo astronaut, first time I heard him speak, he said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And I think that people get very upset when they hear this, and they have been upset with me for discussing it. And I was warned of that. I mean, Martin Cannon was very clear. He said, if you talk about this, you're going to be touching the third rail of this subject, and it will cause people to really, really despise what you're doing because they have such an attachment to a Manichaean worldview of us versus them, sort of a cowboys and Indians in space mindset. And this is part of our evolutionary development, our tribalistic and ethnic development. And, of course, it's what's led to, on this planet, racism and genocide and the Holocaust and Rwanda and Darfur. And now what we're seeing is this juggernaut to try to demonize certain species of extraterrestrial civilizations and to create sort of a cosmic level of this racism. And I think we have to be very careful about this and not take the bait. I think that the population of the Earth are very vulnerable to this kind of deceptive effort. And in fact, my military advisor has a term for this that he learned when he was in top secret programs in the Pentagon, and it is called a deceptive indication and warning, or INW, or a false INW. The pop culture would call it a false flag operation. And it's where something is created for a certain psychological intent so that certain policies can be crammed down the public's throat and the masses will accept it. Well, the really big one that's been worked on for 60 years is the creation of a threat from outer space. I'm convinced there is not one. Now, you cannot prove a negative. One of the things I always say is that you want to say, can you prove that there are no threats from outer space? And I have to say, well, you can't prove a negative. It's axiomatic that can't be done. What we can prove is that the Earth hasn't been invaded by these civilizations. They are very concerned with our hostility. Witness all the Disclosure Project witnesses about the missile silos, nuclear weapon silos being examined, and at times even being rendered non-launchable, so that they were sending a message, please don't blow up this beautiful planet in a massive nuclear holocaust. And I think that what we have seen is that they have some great concern about a civilization or species such as Homo sapiens going from, horse and buggies in 100 years to space travel with thermonuclear weapons, and in the classified world, even more dangerous weapons than thermonuclear weapons. And I think that one of the problems that I see with this whole discussion that often comes up in these circles, and it's particularly rife in the New Age and UFO community, of a belief that, well, since there's so many people on the earth who are troublesome, there have got to be civilizations out there that are like this. The problem with that anthropocentric projection is that in reality, you're not allowed to leave your star system when you are still at that state of evolution. In other words, a sort of quarantine has existed around the Earth, and Neil Armstrong was overheard famously, and this is reported in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, saying that basically we were warned off of the moon. There were a lot of ET craft that were there that did not want us going out into space as part of a Cold War space race, which is what the Apollo mission really was. It was a proxy for the competition with the Soviet Union, and we'd fallen behind during the Sputnik era. And what they wanted was clearly to have a civilization on Earth that would be peaceful and united going out into space. And that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for us to reach that stage of peaceful function, at which point I predict the universe will throw open its arms quite wide and embrace us. Until then, we are under a type of quarantine. And I have had people with the National Reconnaissance Office and the Defense Intelligence Agency tell me things that have been done that have kept us from going and doing things out in space as much as we would like, because we're not viewed as a responsible member of planetary societies, that we are still engaged very much in the past 100 years alone. 160 million at least humans have been slaughtered in warfare on this planet. I mean, there are some planets where that would be the entire population of a planet that we have murdered in warfare. And we're not talking other murders. We're just talking organized state warfare and state murder, war. So this is something which is a very deep look at perhaps how we might be viewed by other civilizations. But if that policy applies here, it certainly is going to apply to other worlds and other star systems, so that certainly there could be intelligent life around other star systems that would have a similar level of dysfunction as we've seen on Earth in the last few thousand years with organized warfare and what have you. The likelihood that they're going to be allowed to develop technologies to leave their solar system and just go sort of free agent, willy-nilly out amongst the universe to victimize other planets is, I think, exactly almost zero. I think it's very unlikely that would be allowed because, as I understand it, there is a universal order. There is a interstellar order that would have a very clear policy preventing such an event, because that's what's happened here, where humans have not been allowed to go through space as extensively as we could, certainly within our classified projects. Ben Rich of Lockheed Skunk Works said that we already had the means to travel among the stars and that we could take ET home. But we're not doing so. And the reason we're not is because we're not at the point of evolution as a civilization, as an entire planet, where we're living peacefully and have vowed to only go out in space in peace. And I think that this is a universal directive, if I can call it that, or a policy. And I think, therefore, the likelihood that there are hostile civilizations that are allowed to just go around and do whatever they want on a planet like Earth that's an emerging civilization is extremely unlikely. Now, I can't prove a negative. You cannot, prove a negative, but all the evidence points to other things going on. Because when you look at the actual ET cases, where they have great concern for human hostility and warfare and nuclear weapons, that is more about us than them. It's sort of like a big cosmic mirror being held up to us. When you look at much of the information we've gotten on abductions and implants, and by the way, the implants are made by a company, I know the company and where it's located, that makes the implants that have been put into people. And then you have the anti-gravity devices that look like a flying saucer, and to any casual observer, they would think they would have seen something extraterrestrial, but it's not. It's completely man-made. And the most interesting, of course, are these creatures. And I've had multiple people. If it was just one person who said they had worked within these projects, creating or maintaining or managing these programmed life forms that look like, quote, aliens, I would have dismissed it. But it's at least a dozen people all over the world who have been inside these projects. Now, this is why there's a lot of confusion right now, because there are certain people who come forward who've been in those projects, but these projects are highly compartmentalized, and they didn't know that these creatures were man-made. They just knew they were running around and doing stuff. So the question becomes, when you have a highly compartmented project, you have to go deeper and deeper to find out what the source and origin of any given being is or experience is, because what you find when you begin to pull back all the layers of this is that you hit 38 layers and you're still digging, and you find you have 100 more to go. And that's what I've discovered over the last 19 years of working in this area. And this is a very, very complex question, because if enough stagecraft, as it's called, can be created, and enough people can be deceived to conclude that there is at least one or two extraterrestrial civilizations that are a threat, that will justify weaponizing space in the minds of the militarists and the minds of, frankly, the warmongers and the war profiteers who profiteer from conflict. So I think that, this is unfortunately something that has to be calculated into the worldview and the dominant, I have to say, the dominant myth that's in the UFO and New Age community, which is, there's nothing New Age about it. It's the oldest story in the book of people dividing into camps and engaging in this sort of divisive view that there are the good aliens that we should ally with and the bad ones that we should, not, and that there is this, very dramatic basis for a conflict. I don't see that actually existing, and I think that we have to be very careful we don't go there in an unwarranted way. And I think that people have had a lot of false information given to them unwittingly by people who, take things at face value. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with a multi-hundred billion, if not multi-trillion-dollar disinformation campaign that humans have had now since the 1940s and 50s, you cannot take anything at face value. You have to question everything. And that's why I would tell people to be very cautious about reaching these fearsome conclusions about things that are not as obvious as one might think they are.